I want to send a special thank you to ClayShare for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. Through their online ceramic education platform, they offer hundreds of full-length classes, as well as thousands of instructional videos that can be streamed straight to your smart TV or compatible device. They offer a wide range of topics that are perfect for the beginner to the experienced potter. With your membership, you'll receive weekly live tutorial broadcasts, access to virtual workshops with well-known artists, and special discounts on ceramic supplies. If you sign up today, use the offer code RAMBLER25 to receive a 25% discount on your first 3 months. For more information, check out clayshare.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 371 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Janet Koplos about her long career as a writer and critic. She started writing about art in 1976 and has served as senior editor for Art in America from 1990 to 2009. She's been the author of numerous books, including her most recent, What Makes a Potter? Functional Pottery in America Today, which we talk about in depth in this episode. If you guys would like to get a copy of the book, you can find it wherever fine books are sold. That is published by Schiffer Publishing, so you can also go to their website and order from them directly. On today's Amico Community Corkboard, we have the 29th annual St. Croix Valley Pottery Tour. That's going to be happening May the 7th through the 9th, and that tour will feature 64 of the country's best potters. For more information, visit minnesotapotters.com, or you can follow St. Croix Valley Pottery Tour on Instagram. I'd like to take a minute and thank the folks that have been donating to the show. We are listener-supported, so I'd like to thank Rose Schreiber-Stanthorpe for her recent contribution. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do that at the website. That's talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So I wanted to start talking about your time in Japan. You were an art critic for a daily newspaper. So can you talk about the pace of that work, like working for a newspaper as a critic, and how that gave you skills that you then, use later in your career?
Oh boy, there's a lot to say about that. Well, I had already been writing before then. I was an experienced critic when I arrived in Japan, and I looked for an outlet because I was just there because of my husband's work, not my own. But it turned out to be better for me than anybody. It was fabulous for me. So I applied to one of the English language newspapers, which was prestige newspapers for all published by the Japanese publishers. And when I started doing that, well, in the first place, arriving in Japan and trying to find serious art, I would ask people about art galleries and they would send me to all the tourist horrible places. But gradually I found my way to some serious galleries, but I didn't speak Japanese. So I was simply looking and really didn't know much about what I was seeing. So it took a while before I felt like I could comment on the things that I was seeing without being a fool, and then I applied to one of the newspapers and was taken on. So by then I knew of many galleries and I would go around, but I would rush around and see things on Monday and my deadline was Tuesday. So I had to write that night and then it appeared in the newspaper on Friday. But I just saw everything that I could. And well, I hope it doesn't sound like bragging, but once an American critic was in town and wanted to go around with me one day, and he was just totally wiped out. And he later wrote about that account and called me indefatigable, which I think I was. I was young enough at the time to have the energy to just go everywhere. But I had to look at what I was seeing and try to think about what the work was telling me, because I didn't know the artists. I didn't know the language. If you go into the galleries, I couldn't even tell whether an artist was male or female because I couldn't read the names. But the one really good thing for me was that typically at that time, the artist would have a little portfolio sort of news clippings and pictures of previous works and that sort of thing in the gallery. So I could look through that, see what they'd done before, and then look at what I was seeing. And you get more of a sense of what the artist is after. And as I began to meet people who spoke English, and I also hired someone to translate catalogs for me, I discovered there was a reasonable degree of correspondence between what I thought I was seeing in this work and what the artist or other critics analyzed. And that really pleased me, because I was able to see that, things that the work communicated, not what the artist said was there, because artists may think that they have an intention of putting something in the work, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's there. If a typical viewer can't figure it out, then it's not really there, no matter what the artist intended.
Well, I wanted to talk about this idea of the cold read, because as a critic, it's important. Well, I'm not a critic, so this is my observation as a journalist who interviews people about their lives. I'm noticing when artists present their work to critics, there is this feeling of the cold read. Like the critic comes in and theoretically you could just read the work for what it is. But I think we know, being in a community of makers, that if you know the person's work and you know about them or about the ideas in their work, it's very hard to get that actual sort of cold read that is not based on the person, but it's based on the work. So in this situation where you're in Japan and you don't speak the language, it feels like this was an actual cold read. Like you could see the work for what it was without any, prior understanding of the artist.
Yes, that's true. I believe that. And that's why I felt it was okay to do that. I felt that I was addressing the work directly and that was important. But it is true. I would have to acknowledge that I would probably never get as deeply into it as the artist did, or as someone who closely was following the work over a long period of time would be able to do. And that's true in the same sense that often when I do a studio visit and I see an artist's newest work, I don't like it as well as the work that I already knew and had come to some kind of a understanding and familiarity with. Because the artist is always ahead of where I'm going to be.
I think that's an interesting observation, because I'm interested in the role that the critic plays within the community, because the artist makes the work, or the craftsperson makes the work, and then by the time it gets to the critic, that thought process is already ended. But depending on, what community we're talking about, whether it's clay or the larger craft community or the fine art world, the critic has a lot of power, because the critic is often putting their stamp, on the work. This is especially in the, 60s era painting critics. They kind of put their stamp on that work, and then all of a sudden these people were superstars. So they were the critic can become a gatekeeper for larger success. But I don't feel necessarily like you've been that type of critic. So can you talk about like how you see yourself as a critic within the art, craft, and clay communities?
Well, I don't think there are really critics like that anymore. Clement Greenberg, in the time period that you're referencing, was certainly one. He was even the kind of critic who went into a studio and told an artist what they should be doing. And I would never do that. I'm interested in art because the artists go someplace that I wouldn't think of. They take me to new places. I think of myself as an ideal viewer, simply one that comes to a work and pays careful attention to it. not privileged, and I don't believe I have power, and I don't particularly want to have power. I want to tell you as a reader about how it seems to me, but it's always open to discussion. And even in the case of critics of power, they have to be persuasive. They have to explain what it is that they see that's important in the work, because nobody has a real godlike role. Nobody gets to say, this is the final choice. There's always going to be, even if a critic presumes to have that power, they can be undercut by other critics, or it's subject to argument. So it has to come to a kind of consensus before somebody really becomes the great artist that we all know and all remember. It's not the product of a single person's judgment. And well, let me think about this. I was going to give a gendered explanation, and then I don't know if I should do that. That's extrapolating from my own situation of not wanting to have that power, in the same way that if I'm with a group of people, I don't want to dominate the conversation. I'm an observer. I like to watch. And I like to second guess, basically. I mean, that's what a critic is doing, looking at the work and saying, oh, well, you didn't do this good enough, or you didn't do that good enough, or you did, But I'm not there doing the work. I'm not being creative. And actually, this leads maybe off on a tangent, but some critical publications, notably Art Forum magazine, have been noted for saying that they don't edit the criticism because that is a piece of art as well. And I don't believe that either. I think that the critic is always in a, what would I say, a parasitic position. The critic, to me, is really nothing without the artwork. The critic, it doesn't start with the criticism, it starts with the artwork. And therefore, well, that just means that I'm not a theoretical critic. I don't want to write long essays and establish some argument for what people should be creating. I guess I've called myself an experiential critic, meaning that what's important to me about this is what I get out of it. I like looking, and when I know I'm going to write about something, I look better. I look more carefully. And so I get more, and that is enjoyable to me. That's my satisfaction in understanding this about the work.
And I think coming from that perspective of being a fan, like I would imagine that you write about people that you not necessarily love their work, but you're interested enough to write about them. That's a perspective of being a fan, as opposed to being like sometimes I think people bring a lawyer-like perspective to their jobs, regardless of what the job is. They almost bring this, I'm going to prove this is right or wrong to whatever they're doing. And I think when a critic can embrace the fact that they like what they're doing, that they like the objects they're looking at, it seems like it would give a different emotional tone to your experience of researching someone, looking at the work, and then sitting and writing about them for however long it takes to finish the piece.
Right. You learn as you work on things. When I was working at Art in America, I could ask to review shows of work that I was interested in, but I was also sometimes asked, the editor-in-chief wanted a review of somebody and nobody had asked to do it. And so they would ask me if I could run down and see this show and write about it. And so I decided I always wanted to do that, because even if I didn't really like that work and would never have chosen it, it was educational to me to try to make the argument and try to understand it through that process of writing. Because, writing is just, it's a process of thinking. Another writer that I know once said to me that writing was easy when she knew which she wanted to say. And I thought, that's true. But for me, I never know what I want to say until I write it. I work out my thinking at that time.
Can you talk about your time at Art in America in terms of being a writer and then also becoming an editor so that you're editing other people's work?
Well, Art in America actually had no staff writers. We were all editors, and that was our job, was to edit other people's writing. And at the time I started working there into the end of 1989, I think at that particular moment, most of the editors on staff did not also write for the magazine. They taught, or they did, other activities, because the pay was so terrible that everybody did something else for additional income. But I was always interested in writing. And when I was a writer, I would sometimes think that editors that were working on my stuff were not very good, and I could do a better job than they could. So it was great being at Art in America, because I got to be in both sides of that equation. I couldn't edit myself, of course. The other people were editing anything that I wrote. Wait, I forgot again where this question started.
Well, I just wanted you to contrast being an editor versus a writer, and I think you've addressed some of that. But can you talk about when you're editing other people's work, how do you keep their intent clear, but clean it up to make what they're saying stronger, but not what you're saying, if that makes sense?
That it's true, and that is tricky. That's something a good editor keeps the voice of the writer. There are editors who run things through the mill of their own opinion, and everything comes out being the same. But no writer wants to work with an editor like that. Everybody writes because they want to have their own say, and therefore to have that remain in the published article, it is important to any writer. But so what you have to do as an editor is attend carefully to the style and the tone and the vocabulary. You have to be sure not to insert your own vocabulary in somebody else's writing. But you also have to look for information, evidence of what they're saying. And you're looking at pictures of the work as you're editing the piece. And so sometimes you go back to the writer and say, where does this come from? Can you support this observation better? So it's an interesting educational and thinking process to be editing somebody else's work. But a good magazine, in my opinion, has a lot of different voices in it. So you hear those various writers speaking, and it hasn't been edited out in the process of some uniform goal. Art in America, on the other hand, did have a reputation for being heavy editors. So we did not just let anything go through. And after each of us staff editors had thought, when we thought we were finished with our editing process, it was submitted to Betsy Baker, the editor-in-chief, who ran the magazine for 30 years. And then she went over it again, and very often sent it back to us with further questions or further expectations that something be clarified or expanded upon.
Can you talk about the way magazines have changed throughout your career? Because within your writing time, both as a newspaper writer and as a magazine, the digital era has happened. So magazines have, I want you to talk about how you've seen magazines change as the digital era has come in.
Well, let's see. I don't know what the future of magazines is. I mean, when I got going in journalism, there was journalism everywhere. There were newspapers everywhere. Every town had a newspaper. There were magazines everywhere. There were critics, let's say art writers. Maybe they didn't deserve the accolade of being called critics. But there were many, many venues, many opportunities, and absolutely that has shrunk up. And I think it's worrisome, because the times when, from my perspective at least, when the most exciting work was going on in any town was when there was a critical response. There was kind of dialogue between critics as viewers and the artists making the work. And as that occurs, I don't know what it means for the art world. The feedback, I have complained publicly before that the feedback that you get nowadays is you post a picture of your work on Facebook and all the comments are beautiful, awesome, one word, nothing, generalities, stunning means nothing, you know. So we're losing that kind of exchange, it seems to me, that feedback between the critic, the careful observer, and the maker of the work. And I don't know what the solution is, because magazines have never been entirely supported by subscription. It's been advertising, and advertising doesn't need the magazines anymore. Some of them are still buying ads just as the prestige of being included in the magazine. So it means that the whole identity is changing, and I couldn't begin to predict where this is going to go, how it will play out. I mean, I think of the next book that I'm working on now is a history of the New Art Examiner, which was a kind of alternative newspaper based in Chicago, started in 1972 or 1973 and folded in 2002. But when it began, the people in Chicago at that time, everybody in the art world read it. It was the place of exchange. It was where the dialogue went on. And I don't know that there's anything like that anymore, because those little publications there's no money in it. There's no way to pay a writer. There's no way to pay a staff. So where do we go from here? In newspapers, fortunately, the trend lately has been for the very rich people, like the owner of Amazon, to buy the Washington Post. And so it becomes less crucial to cover the expenses through advertising or whatever. But in magazines maybe that's happened because some of the really big galleries, in New York, Gagosian and Hauser and Wirth, anyway, some of those are now publishing a sort of magazine that perhaps favors their own taste, their own selection of artists. But and I haven't really been a reader of those, so I shouldn't comment on the comment, because they're all online magazines now.
Well, that's also a little bit of a slippery slope, because if you have a financial vested interest in the people you're writing about, that can be really tricky.
Well, my impression, and again, I say I have not been reading faithfully enough so that this might be mistaken, but my impression is that they're treating it less as criticism and more as interviews or conversations or in-depth background of work. And I would say that some of the best writing that I've read about artists has been the press releases from their galleries, because, that's if the person that owns the gallery has some writing skill. So not every press release is wonderful to read, but some of them are really excellently explanatory and really good pieces of understanding the work and sharing that understanding.
Can you talk about teaching people how to be critical? So in the instance of teaching in say a university or giving a lecture, you have students that want to learn how to be critics, but there's really a couple parts of being a critic. One is grammar. Like you have to have some writing chops. But then the other thing is observation, like the thing you talked about, being the critical observer. So can you talk about how you teach criticism, both, the P's and Q's of it, but also how you formulate something to say?
Well, I have taught criticism on an adjunct basis in several schools. And in all cases, I was teaching criticism to artists, not to art historians and people who were likely to go on as critics. Although there are some artists who become quite competent and interesting critics. But in the cases of my teaching experience, what I tried to do was just to develop skepticism among them. We did a lot of reading of existing critical writing, and we criticized it. So you think more than twice about reading. Does it hold up? Does it seem supported by the examples? Do you see in the photograph what the or the illustration, what the critic was talking about. So with that skepticism, I think some of the people in these classes have done, fine critical writing. None of them that I have taught have gone on to become noted critics, but I like to think that they're better observers and also better thinkers about their own work. In the first time I taught like that, it was a case of people who were going to be having to write their master's thesis soon, and so the school wanted somebody to kind of coach them on the nature of writing in order to make their theses better written. And so I think it's useful in that sense, even if you don't ever go on, it just makes you a better consumer of criticism to know a little bit about how it works and what its flaws and weaknesses are.
In the clay world, there's a couple artists that I can think off the top of my head that are great writers. Like I think Mark Shapiro has some really interesting things to say. It knows how to write. Like he, every time I have read something, I think about this a little bit like music. Like I really love Paul Simon's songs because he can paint a picture with words. And I feel like good writers that are artists also have that ability that when they write, I can see in my mind what they're writing. So can you talk about interacting with the greater community of like specifically clay or craft artists? Who do you think the people that are doing writing that you find interesting?
Well, shall we talk about the elephant in the room, which is Garth Clark? Okay. Well, I have a funny relationship with Garth. I didn't want to meet him at first because I was so annoyed with him as a critic. He wore so many hats that when he was talking, you didn't know which issue was coming forward in his work. And I've complained about, for instance, about the book that he wrote a long time ago called The Artful Teapot, in which he wrote about lots of people, but he wrote more about the people that he represented in his gallery. So, I think that's a big problem there. But he is a wonderful writer. He is very descriptive. He's animated. He grabs your attention and holds on to you. He also, speaks well. Maybe it's product of the educational system that he grew up in, but he's definitely an important person as a critic. But even so, because of this multiple hats, I think he needs to be read with a little bit of skepticism. I was part of the College Art Association, an awards committee that gave an award for criticism, which Garth won. So, I can't, I'm certainly on his side as an important contributor to the field, but what was your question then?
Yeah, no, I love tangents, so don't worry at all about going on tangents.
I feel like I've done that. I need to write down what the question was so that I can stick to the subject.
No, this is good. Well, on the topic of Garth, full disclosure, he's a good friend of mine, and he has been someone who I've been able to see his public-facing activity and his private-facing activity. And what I mean by that is that he loves to wind people up. Like he likes to agitate people, and that is a funny part of his personality if you're his friend. If you're not his friend, I can imagine it would be infuriating because you're like, why are you doing, why do you want to make people so mad with your writing? But he told me one time, I thought this was interesting, he said you get more reaction with a barbed pen, meaning that if your criticism is pointed, the community reacts. And you talked earlier about dialogue, like the role of the critic is to create dialogue in the community. So can you talk a little bit more about in your own writings, like which books or articles do you feel like created the most dialogue within the community that people really reacted and wrote back to you or became engaged with your ideas?
I'm not sure I've ever written anything that was really controversial. I don't... Typically, I don't get letters to the editor. About the one time I can think of when that did happen was I wrote about, I wrote about an English artist, a woman who is, I can't think of her name. Anyway, was at that time working in clay, but was not making pottery. I mean, it was the kind of touchy-feely clay. And when I wrote about her, I found her work interesting because it did make you respond to the material, and I liked the material of clay, so therefore that's not a bad thing. But anyway, I wrote about her for Ceramics, Art and Perception, and Paul Matthew wrote in and was furious with me because I had used the word ceramic rather than clay, and that was the wrong word to apply. And I just thought, okay, so to me, it just wasn't even worth having that argument. So I either didn't respond to him or didn't carry it very far. But other than that, I just think of myself as sharing what I see, not ruling on things, not making a final judgment on anything, and therefore not as pointed or as sharp as Garth could be. And I do think you do get more of an audience response from that. That's absolutely true. And actually, Glenn Adamson is also good in the same way. I mean, he kind of idolized Garth when he was a student and all that, and has followed in much that same path of making strong statements that are interesting to listen to. Dynamic talk is always better than mumbling or whatever, but yet sometimes I think we fall for that because we think that's what a critic is supposed to be, that a critic is supposed to make sweeping statements and be authoritative. And that's not really the major value, in my opinion.
Well, I've been thinking as you were describing that about the role that pundits play in the news, like the talking heads that they're not telling you what happened on the news. They're telling you what they think about what happened. And now that is so common in our social media landscape. Like if you go on Twitter, if you go on Instagram, people are reposting what someone else said about the news. They're not necessarily reposting like a political argument or Politico article that's telling more of a factual, this is what happened. So can you talk about how you see social media stepping in to fill the vacuum of criticism? Or do you see that?
I think it's a terrible failure at that. I think we hoped that it might do that it would open up and let everybody be a critic, but I think that doesn't work at all. In fact, when I signed up for Facebook long ago, I was hoping that what I would get out of it would be a glimpse of how people spent their studio time, what their life was like as an artist. And there's not much of that. There's a few people who do that regularly, and I appreciate it and value it. But mostly it's just become a way of how we've sorted out the people who agree with us, and we like their comments, and it just reinforces our biases, which of course is happening across the board politically, and just as much as in the art world. So I think the social media has developed a greater sense of community, and I've actually become friends with people, Facebook friends, and I value that contact. It's something that might not have ever happened otherwise. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to exchange with all these various people. So it's good in that sense. And as a clay community, a craft community, or a greater art community, it's certainly nice for us to keep in touch. But it's not the role of criticism. And you're not getting any kind of extended development of any particular thought. I have been just lately playing a little game with myself. Nobody else has noticed it yet, but so maybe I shouldn't call attention to it. But Rob Barnard, who is somebody I've known for a long, long time, has been just posting one picture of one work almost every day with no explanation. There's not even dimensions or anything. It's just the picture by itself. So I have taken to trying to respond to it with us. It might only be a word, but something really specific to how that work affects me, what my response is. So and he hasn't even said anything about it. So I don't know, maybe this is totally lost effort, but it's pleasing to me, nevertheless, to think about this pot and what do I say about this one? Some of them are, some of them are more forceful. Some of them, I've used the word resolute. Some of them are vulnerable, receptive. You can think about that. And maybe I would like to think, I hope that he's noticed that, and I hope that it might be interesting to him to hear a take other than awesome or lovely or great, or or those kind of general reinforcing words that don't really tell you anything specific.
What a wonderful exercise in efficiency also, just for you as a thinker. Like, how do you get it to one word?
Yeah, I've had to work at it. I sit there and look at that pot and think, what is it that distinguishes this from another nearly like it? So it's fun.
Well, I wanted to pivot away from criticism and talk more about your role as a historian. You've written quite a few books on histories, like the book Makers, which was when was that? The early 2000s that came out?
2010, I think.
Okay, yeah. So there's that. There's been a couple histories, and then recently you wrote a book called What Makes a Potter. And for that, you did I hear that you did 150 interviews of potters for the book?
Yes, which was a great mistake. But anyway, I do have a degree in art history, but I have been, just as it took me a long time to get around to using the word critic to describe myself, it took me also a long time to make the claim to be a historian. I don't really feel that I'm as trained as other historians. It was just a local school that had a master's program. It wasn't necessarily one of the great schools that trains major art historians. So I don't want to make too much of a claim. The Makers book was a little bit of an odd endeavor because it was a history. It was intended to be a history, but the two of us who wrote it, Bruce Metcalf and I, he's an artist and I'm a critic. Neither one of us was a historian. So it's a little odd that it worked out that way. I hope that it made it more readable and more of just an ordinary kind of dialogue. And certainly both of us just relished digging into that history and learning more about it. I also wrote a book even before Makers. I can't remember exactly when it was, for the Krauthaus in Holland, which did a lot of ceramic shows. And they wanted a book about the artists who had worked in clay. They were doing an exhibition, and so I wrote an essay on that. And that was a bit of work because I was looking back in time as well as looking far afield in distance at the artists that they had in their collection. But not very much had been written about the clay work of those artists, with the exception there's been books and exhibitions of Picasso's clay work, but most of the others at that time, it was just a small part of their activity. So it was, finding out which could and trying to make a case. I mean, somebody has said that there isn't really history, that we make a history by what we write about something, what we record. And that's just one version of history that can be overcome later on.
So when you have a book that's particularly a history collection device, because, What Makes a Potter, one of the things that I love about it is it's very personal. Like you're writing about the people, but it's often a lot of the writing is actually you transcribing the interview and the answer to their question into the text. So it feels very personal as a book.
Well, that's nice to hear. That's fine with me. Yeah, well, the way I started that, the way it ended up being, it was 160 interviews actually. But I started just off the top of my head because I've always been interested in functional pottery, and I bought it for myself. And I lived in Minnesota where there was so much activity. So I made a list of 75 people that I thought could reasonably be included in a book. My original idea, though, was that I was going to write a whole lot more and just general analysis of the field, that it was going to be much more in my voice writing about ceramics. And then I would have a selected few, maybe a spread of a couple of pages that would have an interview or two as an example, or two. Well, I mean, I thought it might be 10 or 20. But as I began these interviews, one of the things that I did was write to people that I knew in other parts of the country. And for instance, I wrote to California, and I don't know many functional potters from Southern California. Can you tell me about some others? And so I did that, various, trying to cover the whole spread of the country. And so I got some more names that way. And then as I began to do these interviews, I went to the most obvious places where there were clusters of people. I went to the Archie Bray Foundation in Helena, and I went to Minnesota, and I went to North Carolina, and I went to Maine. And people there, instead of wanting to hog the glory to themselves, would often say, oh, if you're here, you should talk to somebody else. And so they would tell me about more people. So I kept it just kept expanding from that beginning list that I made myself, to a point that I said, I can't possibly fit all this in a book. I just have to stop. So I stopped, even though there were people I definitely would have liked to talk to, and that it's unfortunate that I don't know whether they might have made the cut based on the interview in the end. But as I began to narrow it down, well, maybe I should tell for this podcast, that I went through and chose both different stories, different angles that I was getting from these interviews. And also, some people are more articulate than others, and some were just better interviews, more interesting to listen to. So I sorted things out, and I had paid somebody else to transcribe, and also some volunteers had helped me to transcribe, for which I am eternally grateful, because that's a big task. As I began to select the interviews that I thought definitely should go into the book, and I tried to cut them down as much as possible, not to leave out anything major, but just to make it tight, to condense it. I didn't add up how many words, how many pages this was getting to be, but I was afraid that it was too long. It just felt too long. And so then finally, I did add up, and I had 300,000 words, which is too much book. It's 3 books. It's just way over the top. So I had delayed trying to find a publisher for it, because the first thing they were going to ask me was, how many pictures, how many words? And I didn't know. So at this point, I finally said, years had gone by, and with me trying to cut down this excessive length and trying to, decide who I could forfeit, which I hated to do. I finally wrote to 2 publishers and said, I have this enormous manuscript. I can't figure out how to manage it, but maybe you could help me. Would you be interested in this? And both of them were interested, to my astonishment. The length didn't make them go away. But basically, they both said, you have to cut it down. So I was stuck doing the painful thing anyway. One of them, the one I didn't go with, wanted more of my voice and fewer interviews. And I wanted the interviews to be in there because I thought they were so good. I thought people had said such perceptive and wonderful and revealing and satisfying comments that why should I replace that with my own discussion? So I went with Schiffer Publishing, which liked the interviews very much and wanted to keep as many as possible, but within a length that could be accommodated in a single book. So then I just had to make those choices. And I wrote to all the people that I had interviewed to tell them when the decision was made that they were in or they were not. And most were quite gracious and said, oh, that's fine. I'll just be delighted to see this book. I can't wait for it to come out. But a few people took it hard. Somebody said, I thought I had made a more important contribution to this field. And he has, but that's not why I was making these decisions. It was more the particular voice and the distinctiveness of their story. Not that there was a great deal of repetition among all these stories. That was one thing that amazed me. You talk to 160 potters, you think you're going to hear the same stories again and again, and you don't. There's really a lot of variety out of there. One of the people that didn't get into the book had been a museum director and gave it up to make pots.
One of the visual devices you do in the book is that when it's the person in the interview speaking, it's italicized. And then when it's you speaking, it's not italicized. So when you're reading through the paragraphs, you're basically seamlessly switching between your voice, their voice, your voice, their voice. And the only way we know that is the italicized or not italicized, which is such a brilliant visual cue. So is there a precedent for that? Did you come up with that?
I don't actually know if there's a precedent. I just did it, and the publisher was okay with it. And part of the reason for doing that was that, well, this wasn't going to be a Q&A, so it wasn't going to be a literal word per word, because I didn't want my questions in there. I didn't want my voice to be a part of that. So I did this just so that I could slip in whatever transitions were needed to keep it going without becoming present in it myself. So it was an attempt to minimize the interviewer as a participant in the conversation. But one or two of the artists, it's these exceptional people who can speak in an organized fashion from start to finish. It's certainly not the case with me, which is why I'm a writer, so that I can work all that stuff out. But one or two of them, it's really pretty close to just straight verbatim, and others required a good deal more of cutting. I will say to the public at large, if you choose to use this particular Brighten Up podcast, too many people say, and like, especially, there's sentences that have like every third phrase or something like that. Even some of my volunteer transcribers would say, oh, my generation, they really need to clean up their language. Well, I say, everybody has something like that, but sometimes it's hard to even find the content, eliminate all those just spelling noises. So using italic and non-italic just made that unobtrusive. But here's another case of talking about the editing process, because I had to do that and still feel that I was being faithful to the speech of the person. So there still had to be some likes and or there had to be whatever the thing was, but not so many that it became uncomfortable for the reader.
Well, this might be a little bit too much inside baseball talk, but as a editor of people's conversations, I debate with myself about this all the time. Like if someone starts the same sentence 3 times and the third time they say the complete thought, do you take out the first 2?
Yes, because you have
do.
to think of your reader or listener. It's not just, if you're for historical purposes, I don't know whether you keep the original versions, but all the original interviews and the transcriptions for the Pottery book have been donated to the Archives of American Art. So they are available there and anybody can read them, which was another reason that I felt I had to be really careful about this, because anybody can find out how much I edited. So I did not want to be altering things. But sometimes, being articulate is not the same as being a good artist, or is not the same as being smart. It's a particular skill set that not everybody has. And so there are, a few people included in the book who don't speak particularly well, but what they have to say is interesting and important. And so if they need a little help from me as an editor, I think that's quite legitimate. I'm most concerned with the actual content, the stories that they're telling.
When I was doing an artist in residence in Colorado, I was writing artist statements, and Doug Casebeer was the director of the center, and he was editing my artist statements, and he gave me a very direct edit. Like I would write maybe 3 paragraphs, and then I'd give it to him, and he would mark through it with a red pen. And then I would come back and I would take out all the red lines, and I would rewrite it. But what was interesting is he told me this in art and in writing: don't say the same thing twice, because you've already said it. And if you say it twice, it actually makes what you're saying less important. And I've thought about that for years when I'm editing other people's languages. How can I help with the editing process to make what they're saying the most impactful?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Also, just repeating a particular descriptive word, if you've just used it in one sentence, you don't, in a piece of writing, at least, you don't want to use the same word again in the next sentence or even the next paragraph. You want to make it distinctive and particular.
So when you think about the book as a whole, you pared it down from 160 down to 50 interviews. What are the things that you started to see that were trends between the group of people you talked to for this time? Like, did you see any trends emerging in the way people talked about business or aesthetics or any of that?
I've often said that the only thing that I heard again and again, so you could call it a trend, it's not a trend, was the reference to touch as being important to all these people who were making work to be handled and to be used. But other than that, no, I was speaking across generations from people in their, who was the oldest, maybe 80? Not so many fresh out of school people, because why would I interview them? They didn't know it enough yet. They hadn't had enough life experience to give me a story. So probably the youngest was 30, or around 30 at the time of the interviews. But speaking across generations and vastly different experiences and different settings in which they were doing the work. I just don't think there's any kind of I can't think of any generality in the aesthetic or anything. We range from the most almost pop-oriented, highly colored work to the most uncolored, brown and green traditional pottery from the Leach tradition. So nothing holds it together, except the wish to make something to be used and to have that kind of a interaction with the eventual owner of the piece, so that something that you have made and you have handled, you have touched, and it's got your mark on it, is going to be handled in that same personal way by somebody else. So that's the drive that seems to come through in all of this work.
I'm very glad to hear that, in a way, that if you look at 50 potters, we're not all saying the same things. Because sometimes I feel like we do have similar conversations at NCECA, or, I feel like there is a realm of interaction within potters that's very similar, regardless if you're in California or Maine. But it's kind of nice to hear, like, oh yeah, we are actually thinking and working about different things.
What are you seeing as the commonality when in that case?
I think it's a way of talking. So I don't know if it's necessarily what we're saying, but the commonality is potters love talking about process. They love talking about economics. So a lot of times we're talking about like which shows did we do really well in. And then also, what are our thoughts? This is the third thing I've been thinking about is like, what does it appear the community is doing that I'm not doing? And I see this in social media more and more often. I'll find that in Sika, people are talking about like, oh, so-and-so posted on Instagram that they were doing this. That's an interesting idea. Maybe I should do that.
Oh, that's bad. Don't copy.
Well, not copying aesthetics, more copying like, should I be selling more online? Like conversations about that. Not copying like, I should, if everyone's making butter dishes, I should make a butter dish.
Well, that would be consistent with the idea that people who make pots are practical. They want to make utilitarian things, and that's a practical approach to making art. It's art that you can eat off of or whatever is just look at. So to talk about finance or those marketing, PR, that's practical too. So that's quite consistent. That's not necessarily the only thing you're thinking about, though.
Right.
When you're actually making the work, what are you thinking? When you're at the wheel or whatever, what's in your head?
Well, see, that right there, that is a wonderful question. That could be a whole series of interviews, just like what is your internal life like in the studio? Because I think we're often talking about the pots, like what does the pot look like? Not what does your mind look like when you're doing this?
Maybe it could be that you're not thinking about anything when you're at the wheel, though. Like I've sometimes asked if I've been riding with somebody in a car, and they're silent for a long time, and they're driving, and I say, what are you thinking? And they'll say, oh, nothing. I was just, my mind was empty. I was just doing the things that you have to do, watching the road and keeping your hands on the wheel. And maybe it's the same when you're sitting at the potter's wheel. Huh? I don't know.
So I wanted to wrap up talking and thinking about the value of being unique within a community of makers. Because when you see those 50 people in the book, they are different. Like there's some aesthetic similarities, like you did a thing on the St. Croix Valley tour, and you can see aesthetic similarities between, say, Minnesota potters and then, on the conversely, North Carolina potters, there's some aesthetic similarities. But do you think that there is an intrinsic value of being unique in our time?
I think our tendency today is to emphasize this. So that's the tension, because you're doing something that other people are not doing. But how different it is depends upon the context in which you're operating. I mean, you can be doing, if you're only selling to your own community and you're in Iowa, you can be making pots that look very much like what somebody's doing in their own community in Idaho. And that's fine. What does it matter? If that's satisfying to you, if it speaks to your own, aesthetic inclinations, it's not so important to do the extreme thing to make yourself quite distinctive. But there is, can I say there's a tendency? Maybe that's too strong a word, but much pottery nowadays is interested in unorthodox shapes. So we have triangular plates, or we have off-circular bowls. They're still entirely functional, so I don't have any objection to doing that. Where I do have an objection to doing it is, for instance, in that case that of handles, whether handles are useful or not. There are mugs and cups and that sort of thing that have such a tiny handle. It looks very good in visual terms on the pot, but if you had liquid in that cup and you were trying to lift it with only one finger through a very highly placed little handle, then that's interfering with function, and you can still do it, but you're giving up that goal of service.
Because I wonder about uniqueness. Sometimes self-consciousness comes with a desire to be unique. And I know for me, self-consciousness in the creative aspect where you're judging as you're making, that can actually be a really bad situation. So if uniqueness comes with self-consciousness, I think that's not a good thing. But I do see a lot of people in our sort of national pottery circuit trying to be unique because it helps them sell better, which is maybe a different impetus than just being a quirky maker who is not trying to do anything. They're just making what they're making, and it happens to be very different than what everyone else is making.
Well, you do have stuff out, so being distinctive draws people to you. That's legitimate. I mean, that's reasonable. Why would you buy one product as compared to another if they were exactly the same? What would be the reason for choosing one? So to distinguish them, to find something unique. But I just hope it's something unique that's true to you, that satisfies some, historical experience or some life bias or whatever it is, but it has to be. I mean, we are all unique, right? None of us are exactly the same people, so we can make things that are true to ourselves that would still be unique. I would think there's infinite options out there.
Well, the reason I brought this up is there's this amazing quote that I think it's Will Swanson said. Someone asked him about his pots, where are you in the pots? And his response was, I'm in the pots because these pots allow me to live a lifestyle that I want to live. And that's where I am. I'm in the lifestyle of the person making the pots, which I've never heard anyone say that. And I thought that was such a subtle, brilliant thing to say, because if you look at his forms and his glazes, you would say that maybe that's not the most unique. They're not highly decorated. They're not whatever. But he was saying these pots allow me to live the life I want to live. And I thought that was amazing.
But his pots are unique in a sense that they are so quiet and reductive, and they're so comforting to use. They're so easy to relate to. He says that as well, that maybe if you make things a little more general and have a little less of your own personality in them, that makes them more available to lots more people.
Well, I wanted to thank you for doing the book, because it's such a joy as an interviewer to read all of these interviews with these folks. So the book is amazing. Where can people get it?
Well, I don't want to say Amazon, but you can order it through any local bookstore, and I think it would be a very nice thing to order it through your local neighborhood bookstore and keep them alive. So it's around.
Do you have any way that people could get in touch with you? Like, do you have social media or a website if people wanted to talk about any of the things we've discussed today?
I do not have a website. I bought a domain name and have never done anything with it. But I don't mind getting emails. I mean, I do get a lot of emails already. And so if you have a huge response to this and I get a zillion more emails, I'll be in trouble. I'll be sorry. But I'll take the risk at this point that if somebody wants to extend the conversation, my email is just my name, Janet Koplos, with no punctuation, @gmail.com.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's nice to talk to you. We're speaking the same language. Okay.
Definitely. Thanks. It was a pleasure to talk with Janet. She has such a deep knowledge and understanding of craft as well as criticism and writing. So a pleasure to connect with her. If you guys would like to get a copy of the book, What Makes a Potter, that is available wherever fine books are sold. That is published by Schiffer Publishing, so you can also get a book directly through their website. Before we go, I'd like to do one more plug for today's Amico Community Corkboard, which is the 29th annual St. Croix Valley Pottery Tour. That's going to be happening May the 7th through the 9th and features 64 of the country's best potters. For more information, including links to each of their online stores, you can go to minnesotapotters.com. Also wanted to give a special thank you to ClayShare for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. They are an online streaming ceramic education platform that you can access through your smart TV or compatible device. If you sign up today, use the offer code RAMBLER25 and receive a 25% discount on your first 3 months. To sign up today, visit clayshare.com. Also wanted to say that we are wrapping up the 9th season of the show. I'm going to take a break next week, and then we'll be back with Season 10 in the early part of May. Thank you guys all for tuning in, and I will see you then. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.